to see John and Angela. Really, really encouraging. Lift us up a little bit. So we're continuing our series of getting comfortable. What started off in my mind was like 3 parts. Has now turned into a bit of a realm, so we're going to be here for a while on this. But we're learning things as we go along. So we're going to look at getting comfortable in Egypt today. There were 2 pharaohs who were looking for a sarcophagus. Is that how you pronounce it? Sarcophagus, yeah. And so they walk into a sarcophagus salesman, and this first pharaoh said to the guy, "We're looking for the cheapest sarcophagus you have for sale." The salesman asked, "Are you not looking for a fancy one?" And the second pharaoh said, No, we're just trying to get a mummy's worth. I thought that was good. I thought that was okay. Anyway, after selling the brother Joseph into slavery, we know that Joseph rose to second command in Egypt after interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. A little while later, a famine struck the land, so Jacob and the rest of his family came to Egypt to get some food and settle there. And it was on their last visit to Egypt that Joseph finally reveals to his family his identity. And he tells them, "Listen, don't feel bad about this. This was all a part of God's plan in order to save them." A scripture reading in Genesis 47, there, 1-6, tells us about how they came to settle in the land of Goshen. To summarise that, Pharaoh basically said, "You're Joseph's family, aren't you? You're the Joseph with the dreams, the Joseph who saved Israel, the Joseph who stored away food for our time of famine." And he more or less says, "Do you know what? Come on in. Come on in. Take the best land and go and settle there and be in charge of some of our livestock." And that was kind of the arrangement, if you wish, as we get there. So for the next 430 years, the Israelites prospered, they acquired property, and they rapidly grew to about 3 million people in the land of Goshen. Life was good. Life was absolutely great. And to them, they must have thought, this is the promised land. That's what they must have thought. Great time. You could think about it. They enjoyed the endless supply of food, especially the pots of meat. And the fish. Well, they got the fish for free because that was coming from the River Nile. Yeah. And so, not to mention the luscious cucumbers and the melons, the taste of the leeks. Must have been incredible. And the onions as well, not to mention what the garlic was like. And so, yes, life was absolutely great here in Goshen. Why bother going to the promised land when we're comfortable in Egypt? Why bother? But while Israel got comfortable in Egypt, Moses began to feel uncomfortable. Exodus 1:8-10 tells us there's a new king in town. There's a new king. And this king had no idea who Joseph was. He had no idea what Joseph had done in the past. And this new king is absolutely terrified that Israel is going to join forces with everybody else in the land and take over. And so what did he decide? He decides to place them into forced labour. And he went to the extent of getting Hebrew babies and throwing them into the Nile. This guy was ruthless. Absolutely ruthless. And this must have gone on for a while because Moses appears to be absolutely oblivious to what's happening to his people and what's happening around them. Now, I'm sure you and I could relate to that. You know, when you're younger, you don't take much notice of what's going on in the world, do you? You're oblivious to what's happening in the world. But as you get a little bit older, you start to take an interest in what's going on in your life and what's happening in the world around you. When you're younger, you don't watch the news. You know, you don't read newspapers. But when you get older, you start to become aware of what's happening around you. And it appears that that's what's happened with Moses. As he got older, he starts to see what's really happening in front of his eyes. I say that because when Moses was 40 years old, he finally decided to visit his people. Makes you wonder, what was he doing for the first 40 years of his life? Well, I know the Bible tells us he was, learned of all the way the Egyptians and all that sort of thing, but his people must have been out of his mind a little bit. And notice the text says, one day. One day. It's that day that he sees how his people are suffering. It was in that moment that Moses began to feel uncomfortable. It was in that moment, according to Hebrews, that Moses refused to have anything to do with Pharaoh, more or less. And it was in that moment that Moses decides that he would rather be persecuted with his people than enjoy any kind of sinful things that Egypt had to offer. It was in that moment that he went on to kill an Egyptian and fled to Midian. Isn't that amazing? How 40 years of life could go by and in one day things change. You start to see things differently, don't you? But not only did Moses know what was going on, but God had been watching the whole time. He knows exactly what's been happening. When we go to Exodus chapter 3, the Lord said to Moses, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of the slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into the good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. See, when God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, he tells Moses quite clearly, don't think for one moment I haven't seen what's been going on. I've seen everything that's been going on. And remember that Moses and the Israelites have been in Egypt for 430 years. Life is good. Life is great, like we've been talking about. They've got houses and endless supplies of food. They were comfortable. But now, because they've been persecuted and oppressed, now they decide to cry out for help. Now they cry to God. And God said, I've heard your cries. I've heard them. He knows that his people have now become uncomfortable. And he tells Moses that he's going to rescue them. He's going to deliver them from their oppression. But it appears, well, when they were comfortable, they totally forgot about who God was and their comfort. Do you remember Abraham? Isaac, Jacob, remember the promises that God made to them? That's what he reminds Moses of. And he says, I am their God. I'm their very God. And it's time for my land promise to be fulfilled. And notice what happens next. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what is his name? And what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And so after giving excuse after excuse after excuse why Moses isn't the man to go to tell Egypt to let his people go, he asks God for a name. Now, we must remember, and the Hebrew words here, Ehu, Asher, Ehu, is basically the pronunciation. It's not a name. It's not a title. It reveals some aspect of his nature and his purpose. He is Yahweh, yeah, the self-existing one. He is also called El Shaddai, yeah, the all-sufficient one. He's also called Elohim, the all-powerful one. And so the very fact that Moses needs a name to tell the Israelites surely tells us they've forgotten all about God and who he is. And we know how the rest of the story goes. Moses goes back to his people. God sent plague after plague after plague. The last one being the death of the firstborn. And then Pharaoh finally lets the people go. So let me share with you a few applications from our story today. Number one, don't forget that God still sees. You see, God saw what was happening with his people. And whatever you're going through right now, you need to believe that God still sees. He sees it. For example, there's a woman called Hagar, an Egyptian slave woman. She's kicked out of her family house with Abraham and Sarah. She's alone. She's pregnant. And she's underneath a tree, thinking nobody cares, nobody can see. And look what happens. After the angel of the Lord spoke to her, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. In other words, in Hebrew, this says, you are El Roy, the God who sees. You see, God hasn't got a name. They're all descriptive words that describe his purpose and who he is. Life can be absolutely difficult at times, and I get that, and it can be really disheartening. But we can get through when we remember that God sees everything. Nothing in all of creation is hidden from God's sight. He sees it all. And he sees you. Whatever you're going through right now, God sees. It reminds me of the story of a house that was just blazing with fire. And on the second floor there was a little girl. She was stuck in the room. The room was absolutely filled with smoke, so she couldn't see anything. So she's absolutely desperate. And she cries out, Daddy, help me. Now Daddy's outside. And he's on the bottom floor. And he shouts, jump out of the window. The little girl said, but Daddy, I can't see you. And the father said, it doesn't matter. I can see you. You see, when life gets challenging and we can't see in front of us and it looks difficult and we think, oh, I've lost sight of God, never forget that God never loses sight of you. Regardless of what's happening in your life. He sees it all. Number two, don't forget that God still hears. God heard the cries of his people in Egypt, and he still hears the cry of people today. You know, when you pray to God, do you have confidence that God not only hears, but God will give you exactly what you need? Do you have that confidence? You know, if you ask God for some bread, do you think he's going to give you a stone? If you ask God for some fish, you think he's going to give you a snake? That's the whole point of this, what Jesus says here in Matthew 7. He gives us exactly what we need at the exact moment. William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, he says, work as if everything depends on us and pray as if everything depends on him. One of the best remedies for a troubled heart is prayer. See, we all have our moments where sometimes we want to just lock ourselves in a room and just pour our eyes out. And we think nobody sees. God does. We think that nobody cares or God is not listening. But he does care. And he is listening. In fact, he wouldn't ask us to pray when we're suffering if he isn't interested in our suffering. He wants to get to know what's going on. He wants us to communicate with him to help so that he will help us. Number three, don't forget that God still delivers. You know, God delivered his people from the land of Egypt. And he's still in the delivering process today. Sometimes we feel ourselves in a position where, I guess you could say, our backs are up against the wall. It's a place where there's no turns. There's no avenues of escape. And there's no easy way out. And some of you, in fact I know this, some of you are in circumstances where you need deliverance. Maybe it's a sin that you're wrestling with. Maybe it's an addiction you're wrestling with. Maybe it's a financial crisis or a health crisis that you're wrestling with. But whatever it is you're wrestling with, God can deliver you. He really can. If God can deliver Daniel from the mouth of the lions, let me tell you, he can deliver you whatever you're going through. If God can deliver Paul and Silas from a prison, he can certainly deliver you. If he could bring you to life after being dead, he can certainly deliver us from anything that we're wrestling with. You know, we're going through the Gospel of Matthew right now. And already we're only, 9 chapters in. And how many times have we seen Jesus delivering people? Over and over again, isn't it? That's the story of Jesus. The story of Jesus is about deliverance. It's about deliverance from sickness, deliverance from heartaches of life, deliverance from possessions, and deliverance from sin. That's what the story of Jesus is all about. The psalmist said, I sought the Lord and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Loved ones, I don't care who you are, I don't care what your background is, I don't care what you're going through at this very moment, God can deliver you. He really can. But you need to ask him. You need to pray for that to happen. Number 4, don't forget your one-day moment. Moses had his one-day moment. Do you remember yours? Many people today won't turn to God when their life is good because they don't see a need for him. I, for one, I didn't see my need for God when I was younger. Life was good. Life was great. But it wasn't until I admitted to myself that my life was actually in a mess, a serious mess. It was then I had my one-day moment. And I'm looking around here and even online. And I know that every single one of you have had your one-day moment. You've all had it. You've had that moment when you've seen your need for Jesus. That's your moment. Moses went from being a fugitive to becoming a leader of God's people. Peter went from being a fisherman to become a fisherman of men. Mary Magdalene went from being demon-possessed to becoming a devoted disciple of Jesus. Saul persecuted the church, and he went from that to become an apostle of Jesus. And the apostle Paul shared his testimony, his one-day moment, at least 3 times in the book of Acts. And we should do the same. Never be ashamed of it. Peter says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. We've all had our one-day moments, loved ones. We've had them. And your one-day moment is basically your testimony. And your testimony consists of 3 things. What was your life like before you met Jesus? Number 2, how did you encounter Jesus? And number 3, what's the results? It's as simple as that. And all of us have got that. And so we've got a chance to share that with others. Share it. Don't be embarrassed. Don't be ashamed. You're talking about what God has done in your life and how he's transformed it. And so God can take you right now from wherever you are and he can do great things through you. Never underestimate what God can do through you. Finally, number 5. Don't forget God when you're getting comfortable. In the land of Goshen, the Israelites were comfortable. Life was good. Life was great. Until God allowed them to become uncomfortable. How's your life going? Good? Great? You comfortable? I remember one time I was preaching at Corby and I started with that opening line, everybody comfortable? And everybody's like, yeah, we're all comfortable. And I said, that's the problem right there, isn't it? Then I got their attention. And sometimes you have to do that. Notice what the proverb says. Give me enough food to live on, neither too much nor too little. If I'm too full, I may get independent, saying, God, who needs him? If I'm poor, I might steal and dishonour the name of my God. You see, God wants us to enjoy life. Jesus came to give us life and give us it to the full. He wants us to enjoy it, but it needs to be balanced. Because it's during those times of comfort that we keep falling into the trap of becoming self-reliant and thinking to ourselves, in fact deceiving ourselves, and thinking, God, who needs sin? Look how great my life is anyway. And on the other side of the coin, it's during those times of want that you may end up doing something stupid like stealing and end up dishonoring the name of God in the process. So our lives need to be balanced. And we live a balanced life by doing what Paul says in Colossians 3:1-4. We live a balanced life by keeping our hearts and our minds set on Christ, not on earthly things. We live a balanced life by reminding ourselves that we're not supposed to live here forever on planet Earth. This is only temporary. We're heading for a glorious future with Christ Jesus. You see, Israel got comfortable in Goshen, but God had other plans. He wanted to take them to the promised land, a land way beyond their wildest imaginations. And for us today, He doesn't want us to get too comfortable on planet Earth. Why? Because this is not a final destination. He wants us to go to a place way beyond our wildest imagination called heaven. And so, loved ones, I want to encourage us all this morning to just think about what we've talked about here and not get too comfortable here on planet Earth. We're going to leave this place one day, and I pray that we never forget our one day moment we decided to follow Jesus. God bless you.